Imagine Thomas Jefferson, the great architect of American liberty, standing on the grounds of his Virginia plantation. In one hand, he holds a vial containing the absolute cutting-edge science of the Enlightenment, a smallpox vaccine. It's this triumph of human reason over nature. But in his other hand, he holds the legal deed of ownership to the very human being he is about to vaccinate. So you have to ask yourself, what allows ideas of liberty to survive when revolutions, institutions, and their defenders reproduce the power they opposed? Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
It is, honestly, the defining paradox of modern history, and to even begin to untangle it, we have to fundamentally correct this massive gap in how we perceive intellectual history.
Right.
Because if you mention a word like rationalism to most people, it conjures up a very sterile, almost academic image.
Yeah, you picture like exceptional isolated thinkers, men in powdered wigs or tweed jackets sitting in these quiet mahogany-lined rooms.
Exactly, just calmly deducing the correct ideas of human existence. We treat the evolution of liberty like it's, like a solved math equation, or a sequential software update that humanity simply downloaded once the code was written.
Which completely ignores the sheer violence and friction of how these ideas actually manifested in the real world. I mean, it makes it sound like these thinkers just possess this pristine logic that the rest of the world simply hadn't caught up to yet.
Right, rather than acknowledging that they were constantly fighting for their lives. And that sterile perception is exactly what we need to dismantle for this deep dive, because the reality of rationalism is not about merely having a good idea or a clever philosophy.
So what is it then?
True rationalism is a rigorous, brutal, and often physically dangerous discipline of dissent. It is a methodology of skepticism that has to be relentlessly tested. And the crucial point here, the absolute hardest part of this discipline, is that it can't just be tested against obvious tyrants.
Like foreign enemies or inherited authority.
Yeah, exactly. It must be turned inward. It has to be tested against your own ideological allies, against the political movements you yourself helped build, and against the deepest internal contradictions within your own worldview.
And your own bank account, in Jefferson's case.
Absolutely.
And to explore the mechanics of that brutal, rigorous discipline, our lens for this deep dive is a phenomenal piece of source material. We are looking at a collection of transcribed speeches, essays, and writings by the late Christopher Hitchens.
It's titled Triumvirate of Rationalism, Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, George Orwell.
Right. And our mission today is to dig into Hitchens' analysis of these three historical giants to investigate how they expose the eternal struggle between universal liberty and the systems that inevitably try to turn absolute power into unquestioned legitimacy.
It's a brilliantly curated grouping because these three figures don't just represent a timeline. They represent a complete diagnostic scan of how power operates.
They hit it from completely different angles.
Oh, exactly. Each of them, in their respective eras, confronted the machinery of absolute power. They each hit a critical juncture where the pure ideals of liberty crashed headfirst into the deeply entrenched mechanical reality of how power sustains and reproduces itself.
Hitchens basically uses them to map the anatomy of human freedom and human subjugation. But before we pull apart this anatomy, we need to establish a very clear, impenetrable boundary for this conversation.
Yeah, that's incredibly important here.
If you are familiar with Christopher Hitchens, you know he was an exceptionally polarizing figure, particularly in the later years of his life. The source material we are drawing from touches on some of the most highly charged, fiercely debated topics of the modern era.
Things like the fundamental nature of religion, his controversial justifications for the 2003 Iraq War, and his blistering critiques of modern anti-war movements.
Exactly. So I want to make it absolutely unequivocally clear to you listening right now. This deep dive is going to impartially report on Hitchens' arguments. We are not here to endorse his political viewpoints, nor are we taking a side on the historical or theological debates he engages in.
Right, we are using his work strictly as an analytical lens.
Our singular goal is to extract the underlying mechanics of power, perception, and systemic control that he's pointing out.
Which is really the most productive way to read him, because the primary hidden system we are investigating today operates far beneath the surface-level noise of daily partisan politics. We are looking at the foundational architecture of how absolute power reproduces itself across centuries.
Because power rarely relies on brute force alone for long.
No, it can't. That is too expensive and too unstable. Instead, absolute power reproduces itself through a very specific set of mechanisms. It works through the quiet normalization of inherited authority, through the demand for fierce, unquestioning ideological loyalty within movements, through deeply entrenched institutional and economic incentives, and most crucially of all, through the absolute granular control of language and vocabulary.
So let's start with that last mechanism, the control of language, because it brings us directly to the 18th century and the first figure in our triumvirate, Thomas Paine. Now, if you grew up in the United States, you likely have a passing familiarity with Paine.
You probably learned about the pamphlet Common Sense in 8th grade history.
Right. He was the great propagandist of the American Revolution. But Hitchens makes a far more profound argument here. He argues that Paine wasn't just a cheerleader for independence.
No, he was the foundational figure who engineered the modern democratic language required to even name the concept of oppression. To understand the magnitude of what Paine accomplished, you have to look at the linguistic and intellectual landscape before he arrived on the scene.
Set the stage for us. What did it look like?
Prior to Thomas Paine, if the concept of rights was being discussed at all, it was strictly the domain of high-level philosophers, aristocrats, or theologians. You had thinkers like Thomas Hobbes writing Leviathan, or John Locke writing his second treatise of government.
Debating the state of nature, property rights, the divine right of kings, that sort of thing.
Exactly. But look at how they were debating it. They were writing these dense, Latin-laced treatises aimed exclusively at the educated elite. They were debating these concepts in private correspondence or in the halls of Oxford and Cambridge.
So for the vast majority of human beings on Earth, rights were this theoretical abstraction that had absolutely no bearing on their daily lives.
It was an academic exercise for the ruling class.
Like tech billionaires today debating the ethics of artificial intelligence at a closed-door retreat in Davos, while the rest of us just have to live with the consequences of whatever they decide. The vocabulary of freedom was completely locked behind a paywall of elite education.
That's a great way to frame it. The architecture of the language itself was exclusionary. What Thomas Paine does is look at the changing demographics of the 18th century. He sees this increasingly literate, self-educated artisan class emerging.
Right, everyday people.
Yeah, he sees working men's clubs, taverns, and coffee houses in London and Philadelphia, where blacksmiths, printers, sailors are gathering to discuss the empirical discoveries of Isaac Newton or the experiments of Benjamin Franklin.
And he realizes the audience has shifted.
Exactly. Paine makes a radical, strategic decision. If natural rights actually exist, they cannot be treated as a philosophical puzzle for aristocrats. They must be weaponized. So he writes for the masses using clear, muscular, accessible prose.
And Hitchens points out this staggering linguistic milestone here. Thomas Paine was the very first person in recorded history to put the words rights and man, meaning all of mankind, together in the same sentence.
Yeah.
Let's just pause on that for a second. If you are listening to this right now, think about how often you hear the phrase human rights. It is the absolute bedrock of our modern political software. It is how we judge nations, laws, and history.
It's everywhere.
And Hitchens is pointing out that before Thomas Paine, that phrase essentially lacked a linguistic architecture. It wasn't just that people didn't have human rights. It was that they literally didn't have the words to conceptualize what they were being denied.
That's exactly it. Paine argued that rights do not come from a monarch's charter, and they do not come from a bishop's blessing. They predate kings, they predate the church, they predate what he called predator governments.
They're innate.
Right. They are innate to human existence simply by virtue of being born. And this was a breathtaking, viral idea that swept across the Atlantic and the English Channel like a contagion. He didn't just give people a political argument. He gave the common citizen the vocabulary required to realize they were being oppressed.
Because once you have the word for human rights, you can suddenly point to a king and articulate exactly why his power is illegitimate.
Precisely.
Okay, but this brings up a massive point of confusion for me. If Thomas Paine is the open source developer who essentially wrote the moral and linguistic blueprint for the American Revolution, I mean, he is the guy who pushed George Washington and Thomas Jefferson toward actual total independence rather than just begging the British Parliament for lower taxes.
He was the driving force, yeah.
Why is he treated like a ghost in the American historical narrative? We have a massive marble monument to Jefferson on the National Mall. We have a towering obelisk for Washington. There was no Thomas Paine Day. Why was the man who gave us the operating system of democracy so thoroughly occluded from the institutions he helped create?
Because Paine actually lived by the rigorous discipline of dissent we defined at the beginning of this investigation, Paine fundamentally understood that if you are a true rationalist, your principles must be strictly universal.
Meaning you can't pick and choose when to apply them.
Exactly. You cannot selectively apply them only when it benefits your side. And that meant Paine eventually had to turn his methodology of skepticism against his own allies.
He turned the diagnostic laser inward. He looked at the American revolutionaries and essentially said, okay, let's test your actual commitment to these words.
Right. During the American Revolution, he didn't just want political independence from the British crown. He wanted the revolution to be absolute and complete. And that meant confronting the most glaring, horrific hypocrisy of the American project, chattel slavery.
Which was the economic engine of the colonies.
Yes. But Paine was fiercely, uncompromisingly abolitionist. He actually helped found the American Anti-Slavery Society alongside Dr. Benjamin Rush. He was actively pushing the Founding Fathers, many of whom were his friends and political allies, to abandon their most deeply entrenched financial interests.
He was telling the guys writing the laws that if they didn't abolish slavery immediately, their entire revolution was a philosophical fraud.
And you can imagine how well that went over. He made himself incredibly unpopular with the wealthy, land-owning elites who would go on to run the new American government.
So he alienates the American institutional power base by demanding they actually live up to the words he wrote for them. And then, not being content to just agitate on one continent, he takes his universal ideals to France.
Yeah, he travels to Paris, and initially he is greeted as a transatlantic titan of liberty. The Marquis de Lafayette physically gives him the key to the Bastille prison to send back to George Washington.
That's quite a souvenir.
It really is. He is granted honorary French citizenship and is actually elected as a deputy to the French National Convention, despite barely speaking French. He is literally a revolutionary hero on two continents trying to help draft a new constitution for a liberated France.
But the French Revolution doesn't follow the American trajectory. It rapidly metastasizes into something incredibly dark.
It begins to turn fratricidal. The Jacobins take control, the reign of terror looms, and the guillotine becomes the primary instrument of statecraft. Paranoia replaces reason.
And what does Paine do?
Paine, remaining absolutely true to his universal principles, performs one of the most astonishing acts of political courage in history. He stands up in the French Assembly to oppose a motion brought by the radical Jacobin leader Jean-Paul Marat.
And this motion was to execute the deposed king, right? Louis XVI.
Yes. The mob, whipped into a bloodthirsty frenzy, wants the king's head. Keep in mind, Paine despises monarchy as an institution more than anyone alive. But he argues passionately against the death penalty itself, stating that a true republic of reason does not build its foundation on state-sponsored murder.
Wow.
Furthermore, he reminds the screaming assembly that this specific king, for all his aristocratic faults, actually provided the crucial funding and naval support that allowed the American Revolution to survive. Paine suggests they exile Louis to the United States instead of chopping off his head.
Which is an almost unfathomably dangerous thing to do. Imagine standing in front of a radicalized, bloodthirsty mob that views any hesitation to kill as proof of treason and telling them, no, our principles dictate that we spare his life. You're essentially painting a target on your own neck.
And it very nearly cost him his life. Because he dared to dissent against the radical revolutionaries, his former allies turned on him. The revolutionary government stripped him of his position and threw him into the Luxembourg prison.
Just waiting to be executed.
He sat there for months, listening to the carts roll out every day, taking people to the guillotine, fully expecting to be next. He only survived because of a literal clerical error.
Wait, what happened?
A guard put the chalk mark designating him for execution on the inside of his cell door rather than the outside while it was swung open for cleaning. So when they came down the hall later to collect the condemned, the door was closed, the mark was hidden, and they walked right past him.
That is wild. But it really highlights the point. He fought the tyranny of the British monarchy, and then he immediately fought the tyranny of the revolutionary mob.
This is why your open source developer analogy works so well for him. He didn't just build a proprietary app for the American elite to use to gain power. He open sourced the underlying code of human rights, gave it to everyone on Earth, and demanded it be applied universally.
And by doing that, he made himself a massive target for all the tech giants of his day, the British monarchy, the American slave-owning elite, and the radical French demagogues. He alienated every single power structure because he refused to let them monopolize the language of liberty.
Exactly. And we haven't even touched on the final and perhaps most dangerous authority he challenged. Because while he was rotting in that French prison, sick with fever and expecting to be beheaded any day, he decided to write a book called The Age of Reason.
Right.
And because he had no library, he wrote a vast portion of it from memory because he knew the Bible intimately.
And The Age of Reason is where Thomas Paine absolutely, methodically dismantles revealed religion and the authority of the church.
He dismantles it with the precision of a watchmaker taking apart a broken clock. He uses his deep, granular knowledge of Scripture to point out its internal, chronological, and moral contradictions.
Hitchens must have loved this part.
Oh, he took great joy in this aspect of Paine's work. He notes how Paine asked the simple, devastatingly logical questions that village atheists and skeptics still ask today. Like, if Adam and Eve only had sons, Cain and Abel, and Cain killed Abel, where exactly did Cain get his wife to populate the earth?
Right. But we must be careful not to view The Age of Reason as merely a list of plot holes in a religious text. Hitchens' central thesis regarding Paine's attack on religion is profoundly, fundamentally political.
Absolutely.
Walk us through that mechanism. Why is debunking biblical literalism a political necessity for a democratic revolution?
Because Paine realized that if the promises of an interventionist revealed religion were true, if an omnipotent God was directly managing human affairs, anointing kings, rewarding the just, and punishing the wicked, then there would be absolutely no logical need for social reform in this life.
Because God would just sort it out eventually.
Exactly. If the only thing that truly mattered was the salvation of your soul and the eternal afterlife, or if a divine plan is flawlessly unfolding, human rebellion is an arrogant interference. Why fight, bleed, and die for a democratic constitution if heaven is going to fix the social contract eventually?
So he's stripping away the ultimate excuse for inaction.
Yes. Paine's radical assertion was that a true republic requires us to realize that we are entirely alone in the universe. We have no divine safety net, and therefore we must turn to one another. We have to build the institutions of justice ourselves, using human reason, because no celestial authority is coming to save us.
And that right there is the final nail in the coffin of his legacy. You cannot simultaneously attack the British Empire, the American slave trade, the French Revolutionary Tribunals, and the foundational texts of Christianity and expect the institutions you leave behind to build marble statues of you.
He offended absolutely every single structural power base in existence.
By holding them all to the exact same standard of universal rational rights, he refused to let anyone hide behind the shield of divine right, institutional necessity, or revolutionary fervor.
Which perfectly sets up the transition to the next phase of our investigation and the profound tragedy of our second figure. Because if Thomas Paine was the ultimate outsider, standing in the cold and drafting the radical, uncompromising blueprints of liberty, Thomas Jefferson was the ultimate insider.
His job was completely different.
Jefferson's historical task was to take those abstract blueprints and institutionalize them. He had to build the actual state apparatus.
And this is where the purity of a universal idea slams face first into the messy, highly incentivized, incredibly compromised reality of actually running a nation.
It is. Jefferson is an endlessly fascinating figure for Hitchens because he represents the absolute zenith of the Philadelphia Enlightenment. He is a polymath in the most rigorous, empirical sense of the word.
He wasn't just a lawyer and a politician, right?
No, Hitchens details how his mind was constantly analyzing the physical world to improve the human condition. He designed a mathematically superior moldboard plow to make farming more efficient. His massive multilingual private book collection literally became the foundational library of the United States Congress.
He was a scientist and architect.
He studied astronomy, engaged in architecture, exhaustively cataloged the flora and fauna of Virginia, even tried to cultivate European wine grapes in American soil. He was deeply embedded in a global network of empirical thinkersmen, like Benjamin Franklin and the chemist Joseph Priestley.
He genuinely believed that the physical and social world could be understood, measured, and systematically improved through human reason, rather than just accepted as divine providence.
And he channeled that empirical Enlightenment thinking directly into the machinery of statecraft. The most pristine revolutionary example of this, according to Hitchens, is not actually the Declaration of Independence, which gets all the attention.
What is it?
The true masterpiece of Jeffersonian rationalism is the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom. Jefferson and his ally James Madison engineered a piece of political technology that was entirely radical for human history up to that point, the legal framework for a truly secular state.
To appreciate how radical this was, we have to look at what was considered normal at the time. Previously, across the globe, it was universally assumed that a state had to have an official, state-sponsored religion to maintain moral order.
It was a given.
Even after the American colonies broke away from the Church of England, the debate in the Virginia legislature wasn't about whether to separate church and state. The debate, led by figures like Patrick Henry, was, okay, since we aren't Anglican anymore, shouldn't we just use taxpayer money to support all the recognized Christian churches equally?
Right. Patrick Henry proposed a general assessment bill to fund Christian teachers, and Jefferson and Madison stepped in and said, absolutely not. The state will support no church. Not equally, not preferentially, not at all.
Which is mind-blowing for the time.
It was the embryo of what would become the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. It established the staggering precedent that a government could function purely on secular, rational grounds, deriving its authority entirely from the consent of the governed, without needing to lean on a divine mandate for legitimacy. A citizen's relationship with the state was completely severed from their relationship with any god.
What's fascinating is how Jefferson didn't just view this secular statecraft as a domestic policy experiment. Hitchens makes a major point about how Jefferson applied this logic to his foreign policy, specifically regarding the Barbary Wars.
Yes, this is a crucial mechanism to understand. When Jefferson becomes the third president of the United States, he inherits a massive, bleeding geopolitical crisis. The Barbary states of North Africa, which were semi-autonomous provinces of the Ottoman Empire, were running a highly organized, state-sponsored piracy and enslavement operation across the Mediterranean Sea.
Taking hostages, essentially.
Over 1 million Europeans and increasingly American sailors had been kidnapped, their ships stolen, and the crews sold into brutal slavery. The established European powers, Britain, France, Spain, had run a grim mathematical calculation. They decided it was cheaper to just pay massive annual tributes, essentially mafia protection money, to the Barbary states to keep their specific ships safe rather than engage in a protracted naval war.
But the United States, fresh out of the revolution, is economically fragile. We don't have the deep imperial pockets to just pay the mafia forever.
Yeah.
And ideologically, Jefferson refuses to submit to the extortion.
Exactly. And the ideological conflict goes back years before his presidency. Hitchens recounts a specific meeting Jefferson had in London in 1786, alongside John Adams with the ambassador from Tripoli.
What happened at the meeting?
Jefferson and Adams asked the ambassador by what right these states were attacking American shipping. They specifically noted that the United States had no part in the historical Crusades, held no historical enmity toward Islam, and was fundamentally not a Christian nation fighting a holy war.
Right, they cited the diplomatic language of the Treaty of Tripoli, which was drafted during Washington's administration. It explicitly stated in Article 11 that the government of the United States of America is not, in any sense, founded on the Christian religion.
They were trying to use the secular architecture of the U.S. government to prove they were neutral in any religious conflict.
But how did the ambassador respond to that?
The ambassador basically informed them that their secular neutrality meant absolutely nothing. He stated that it was written in the Quran that all nations which had not acknowledged the prophet were sinners, and that it was the right and duty of the faithful to plunder and enslave them. It was a stark, unapologetic, religious justification for a massive, brutal economic enterprise of slavery and piracy.
So the universal ideals of the Enlightenment hit the brick wall of theocratic absolutism.
And so, when Jefferson eventually takes the presidency, he doesn't wait for Congress to endlessly debate the issue. He builds a navy and he sends the Marine Corps across the world to the shores of Tripoli to forcibly end the piracy. Hitchens views this as America's first actual war of liberation.
Because he was proving that these democratic secular ideals could actually be defended?
Right, that they weren't just fragile, localized experiments to be bullied by older empires. They could be aggressively defended and even exported on the global stage against theocratic regimes.
Okay, so we have built the monument to Jefferson. He's the Enlightenment hero. He separates church and state, inventing true religious freedom. He crushes international piracy and defends secular democracy. But now we have to turn the diagnostic laser of rationalism inward.
We have to look at the massive, glaring, catastrophic contradiction at the heart of his life.
How does the man who wrote the words, "all men are created equal," own hundreds of human beings? How does the brilliant polymath who designs a better plow to ease the burden of labor and champions secular freedom, purposefully institutionalized chattel slavery.
If we connect this specific contradiction to the bigger picture of our investigation, we see what Hitchens defines as the Hegelian tragedy of Thomas Jefferson. For the listener, a Hegelian tragedy is an important philosophical concept to grasp. It isn't just a sad event or a simple story of good versus evil.
Right, what defines it?
A Hegelian tragedy occurs when two entirely valid, overwhelming, and unstoppable forces collide. In Jefferson's case, it is the devastating collision between noble, universal Enlightenment ideals and the deeply rooted, massive, inescapable institutional and economic incentives of the world he was born into.
It's the moment the pristine ideology hits the brutal reality of the balance sheet.
Yes. The system demands complicity in exchange for power. Remember that Jefferson knew slavery was a moral abomination. In his early original drafts of the Declaration of Independence, he actually included a fierce, lengthy condemnation of the transatlantic slave trade, blaming the British king for forcing it upon the colonies.
But he was forced to strip it out of the final document.
Because the mechanics of political reality dictated it. The delegations of Georgia and the Carolinas flatly refused to sign any document that threatened their slave-based agricultural economies. And northern shipping interests, who profited immensely from transporting enslaved people and the goods they produced, also pressured him.
So the institution of the nascent United States demanded his complicity in slavery in exchange for the political unity required to fight the British.
The system reproduced its power by forcing the architect of liberty to compromise his foundational blueprint. And this Hegelian tragedy only accelerates and gets much worse during his presidency with the Louisiana Purchase.
The Louisiana Purchase is perhaps the ultimate masterclass in how institutional incentives overpower individual ideals. Hitchens points out a fascinating, often overlooked chain of geopolitical events here. We are taught that Jefferson made a brilliant real estate deal, buying a massive swath of the continent from France for pennies on the dollar.
But why was Napoleon willing to sell it so cheaply?
Right, that's the real question.
He sold it because his armies had just been absolutely decimated in the Caribbean by the Haitian Revolution. A successful, bloody rebellion of enslaved people, led by brilliant tacticians like Toussaint Louverture, combined with outbreaks of yellow fever, destroyed the French forces.
Without the massively profitable sugar colony of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, the port of New Orleans and the vast Louisiana territory lost their strategic economic value to Napoleon.
He needed cash for his European wars, so he cut his losses. A slave rebellion created the exact geopolitical conditions for America to double in size overnight.
And this is where Thomas Paine re-enters the story, right?
Yeah.
Paine sees this acquisition not just as land, but as a philosophical blank slate. He goes to Jefferson and essentially says, this is our chance to fix the original sin. We have this vast, new, unorganized territory. We can start fresh, use your executive power to make it explicitly illegal to bring enslaved people into the Louisiana territory.
And Jefferson, facing the most consequential moral choice of his presidency, caved to the system again. The pressure was insurmountable.
Where's the pressure coming from?
The wealthy Caribbean sugar interests fleeing Haiti needed to reestablish themselves and demanded access through New Orleans. The southern cotton and tobacco planters, rapidly depleting the soil in states like Virginia, desperately needed to expand westward to maintain their economic dominance.
The entire American financial system was deeply entangled with the collateral of enslaved bodies.
Jefferson allowed slavery to legally expand into the new territory. By doing so, he guaranteed that as new states were carved out of that land, the nation would be evenly, violently split between slave and free states. Hitchens argues that Jefferson's complicity in that specific moment didn't just delay abolition, it made the catastrophic bloodshed of the American Civil War absolutely mathematically inevitable.
It perfectly illustrates our hidden system. The institution was so economically powerful that it forced the man who literally wrote the operating manual for liberty to expand the borders of subjugation. But I have to push back a bit on analyzing this purely at the geopolitical Hegelian level.
Okay, go ahead.
It is one thing to sit in a presidential office and make a terrible, tragic geopolitical compromise because you feel trapped by the Southern voting bloc. It is an entirely different thing to live every single day of your life on a mountain estate where you personally own the human beings serving your dinner and raising your children.
The day-to-day cognitive dissonance is staggering.
Right. We started this deep dive with the image Hitchens mentions. Jefferson using cutting-edge Enlightenment science to vaccinate his slaves against smallpox. He is using the highest form of rational medicine to protect his human property so they can remain in bondage. How do we even begin to process the psychology of that, particularly when we confront the reality of Sally Hemings?
That is the most difficult and necessary part of the Jeffersonian legacy to unpack. Hitchens leans heavily on the groundbreaking historical methodology of Annette Gordon-Reed here to completely reframe the Sally Hemings paradox.
Because historically, the academic narrative was deeply flawed.
It was. For generations, it was either outright denial that the relationship existed to protect Jefferson's marble image, or once DNA evidence made it undeniable, framing it purely as a one-dimensional story of a powerful, hypocritical white man exploiting a helpless, passive victim.
But Gordon-Reed's thesis changes that.
Her thesis demands that we look at the actual power dynamics and legal mechanics much more closely, particularly during the time Jefferson served as the American ambassador in Paris.
Right, because this fundamentally changes the legal context. Sally Hemings travels to Paris as a teenager to accompany Jefferson's young daughter. And crucially, under French law at the time, slavery was illegal on French soil.
Exactly. This is the pivot point of her life. The moment Sally Hemings stepped onto French soil, the legal architecture of Virginia no longer applied to her. There was established legal precedent that any enslaved person brought to France could formally petition for and receive their freedom.
So in Paris, she was not legally a slave unless she chose to return to America.
She had actual, tangible leverage. She was a bright, capable young woman living in a cosmopolitan European capital. She was learning French. Her older brother, James Hemings, was already there with Jefferson, learning the art of French cooking, and he actually did negotiate for his wages and eventual freedom.
Sally had a profound choice to make. She could have simply walked away into the free black community of Paris, and Jefferson could not have legally stopped her.
So she realizes she holds cards in this negotiation. She is looking at the architect of the Declaration of Independence, and she forces him to the negotiating table.
Gordon-Reed's historical analysis suggests that Hemings struck a highly calculated, desperate bargain with Jefferson.
She agreed to return to Virginia with him, which meant willfully returning to a legal state of chattel enslavement, where her body was once again his property, but only on one absolute non-negotiable condition:
that any children she had with him would be granted their legal freedom upon reaching adulthood.
Which is just an astounding historical moment when you truly think about it. An enslaved teenager uses international legal loopholes to negotiate the future liberty of her unborn children with the man who wrote that all men are created equal, because his words didn't apply to her.
And we know this bargain was almost certainly struck and honored, because the historical record shows that her children with Jefferson were, in fact, the only enslaved nuclear family that Jefferson ever freed.
Hitchens asks us to view Sally Hemings through a completely different lens here. She is not just a passive victim of a horrific, inescapable system. She is an incredibly brave, highly intelligent, calculated actor.
She navigated the absolute worst, most dehumanizing constraints of institutional power imaginable to secure liberty for her bloodline.
Through this lens, she emerges not merely as a footnote to Jefferson's hypocrisy, but as an American founding mother in her own right who had to fight a guerrilla war against the very institutions Jefferson built.
It is the ultimate distillation of our crisis in perception. Jefferson can write the soaring, universal words of liberty, but the systemic reality of power forces Hemings to privately, desperately negotiate for the actual realization of those words.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the mid-20th century, and the third figure in our triumvirate, George Orwell. If Thomas Paine invented the democratic language required to expose absolute power, and Thomas Jefferson demonstrated how deeply institutions will compromise and swallow that language to protect their wealth, George Orwell becomes the master diagnostician of how modern empires take it a step further.
He shows us how institutions actively weaponize language to control reality and make us complicit in our own subjugation.
To understand the diagnostic tools Orwell developed, you have to understand the specific filth of the empire that produced him. Orwell was born Eric Blair, and his family's position in the British middle class, such as it was entirely dependent on the brutal mechanics of the British opium trade.
The British Empire was not just a political entity. In Asia, it functioned largely as a state-sponsored narco-empire. They were using the unmatched violence of British gunboats to force Chinese ports to accept massive shipments of opium that were grown and harvested by colonial subjects in India.
It's an entire global economy built on enforced addiction and military coercion, wrapped up in the polite, bureaucratic language of the East India Company. And Orwell doesn't just read about this imperial machinery in a library in London. He actively joins it. He travels to Burma and puts on the uniform of a colonial policeman.
He becomes the literal enforcer of the empire's will. And it is during his time policing Burma that he experiences a profound psychological awakening. He realizes what Hitchens brilliantly terms the pornography of power.
The pornography of power, that's a striking phrase.
It really is. We are constantly told by institutions that empires exist for noble reasons, to civilize the native populations, to build necessary infrastructure like railroads and ports, or to spread the light of true religion and modern administration. Orwell, standing in the sweltering heat of a Burmese police station, saw right through that sanitized narrative.
Because he realized that the core driving motivation for absolute power is not benevolent administration.
It is fundamentally sadistic. Power is held because human beings deeply, darkly enjoy the psychological thrill of dominating others.
The sheer, unadulterated high of looking at another human being and knowing you have total, unquestionable control over their physical existence.
Hitchens highlights a chilling, highly specific social dynamic from Orwell's writings that perfectly illustrates this. Imagine the social hierarchy of colonial Rangoon. If you were a highly educated Burmese man, perhaps you spoke flawless aristocratic English, you held advanced degrees from Oxford or Cambridge, you were well-versed in Shakespeare and Enlightenment philosophy, you were still fundamentally categorized as subhuman by the British establishment.
So what was the ceiling for a man like that?
The very best you could hope for was to enter the exclusive Englishmen's Club as a highly monitored temporary guest through the front door, and only when explicitly invited by a white officer.
Yeah.
However, a completely uneducated, impoverished Burmese woman who spoke no English and had no social standing could enter any British officer's private villa whenever she wanted, provided she went through the back door as a bought mistress, which in that economic context was essentially a sexual slave.
Let me make sure I am mapping the mechanics of this correctly. The colonial system allowed absolute, unrestricted access for the purpose of sexual and physical domination, the back door. But it permitted zero access for the purpose of intellectual or social equality, the front door. Because admitting intellectual equality would destroy the entire moral justification for the empire.
Precisely. And Orwell, wearing the uniform, realizes he is an active cog in this sadistic machinery. He writes with devastating honesty about feeling the racist, authoritarian policeman growing like a tumor inside his own mind.
He realizes that holding the whip inevitably corrupts the hand that holds it. You cannot enforce a lie without the lie infecting your own psychology.
So, in an act of profound rational dissent, he resigns. He walks away from a secure career and the protection of the colonial service because he realizes his first battle must be to conquer the oppressor within himself.
He strips off the uniform, returns to Europe, voluntarily lives in extreme poverty to embed himself with the working classes in Paris and London, and tries to wash the empire off his soul. But then the 1930s arrive.
The ideological landscape of Europe fractures. The Spanish Civil War breaks out. General Francisco Franco's fascist forces, heavily backed by the military might of Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy, launch a brutal military coup to overthrow the newly elected democratic Spanish Republic.
And Orwell, believing he finally has a clear, unambiguous moral fight, goes to Spain to literally put his body on the line.
He travels to Catalonia and volunteers to fight in the trenches. He joins a militia run by the POUM. For the listener who isn't steeped in the dense, often confusing history of 20th century socialist infighting, the easiest way to understand the POUM is that they were a Marxist, roughly Trotskyist faction.
Right, they believed in a decentralized, international, working-class revolution.
Exactly. They were fighting in the trenches alongside anarchists, syndicalists, and various other left-wing groups, desperately trying to hold the line against Franco's fascist army.
And while fighting on the front lines in Huesca, Orwell gets shot right through the throat by a fascist sniper. It's a famous, almost darkly comic story. The high-velocity bullet goes clean through his neck, miraculously missing his carotid artery by a fraction of a millimeter.
He survives, though he is left with a raspy, damaged voice for the rest of his life. He later joked with typical dry British wit, "If I was lucky, I wouldn't have gotten shot in the throat at all."
But here is the critical pivot of his life. He nearly died a second time in Spain. Not from the fascists in front of him, but from the Allies standing behind him.
This is the trauma that forges the George Orwell we know today. While Orwell was recovering from the sniper bullet, the political dynamics behind the Republican lines shifted drastically. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, was supplying arms to the Spanish Republic.
But Stalin's goals were entirely different from the Trotskyists or the anarchists.
Stalin wanted socialism in one country. He wanted absolute centralized state control. And he needed to prove to the Western democracies that he was a respectable, stabilizing force, not a fomenter of chaotic global revolution.
To Stalin, an independent, decentralized revolutionary was actually far more dangerous than a fascist because they challenged his monopoly on left-wing ideology.
So on orders from Moscow, the Soviet-backed communist forces in Spain turned their secret police and their weapons against their own allies. They systematically hunted down, tortured, and purged the Trotskyists, the POUM leadership, and the anarchists.
The famous May Days in Barcelona, where leftists were shooting leftists in the streets. Orwell and his wife Eileen barely escaped Spain with their lives, sneaking across the border while being actively hunted by the very Stalinist secret police they thought they were allied with in the fight against fascism.
And this betrayal fundamentally alters Orwell's perception of power.
Which brings up a fascinating question. When Orwell gets back to England, he dedicates the rest of his short life and writes his two world-changing masterpieces, Animal Farm in 1984, essentially warning the world about the mechanics of Stalinism and totalitarian communism. Why did he focus so much of his critical diagnostic energy on communism, rather than on the fascism that literally put a sniper's bullet through his neck?
It is a profound distinction, and Hitchens explains it brilliantly. For Orwell, fascism was an obvious, blatant, unmasked evil. When you looked at Hitler's Nuremberg rallies or Mussolini's black shirts beating people in the streets, you didn't need a degree in political science to be convinced it was horrific. Fascism was every abusive father, sadistic colonial cop, and racist thug rolled into a national political movement. It celebrated violence, domination, and irrationality openly. Civilized, thinking people instinctively knew it had to be destroyed. It was a monster that roared in your face.
You could see the enemy coming from miles away. It wasn't trying to hide what it was.
But Stalinism was an entirely different kind of threat. Stalinism was, in Hitchens' words, a poisonous delusion. It presented itself to the world as a scientific utopia. It deliberately hijacked the language of Thomas Paine. It talked incessantly about human liberation, economic equality, the brotherhood of man, and the end of exploitation.
And because it used the correct, noble vocabulary, it completely disastrously fooled the Western intelligentsia.
Brilliant artists, writers, and intellectuals sitting comfortably in London, Paris, and New York convinced themselves that across the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union, a perfect, rational society was finally being constructed. They read the sanitized reports and believed them.
They actively excused the engineered famines in Ukraine, the show trials, and the mass executions of the gulags, because they believed these were just the unfortunate, necessary birth pangs of a greater historical good.
Which brings us to the most crucial, terrifying mechanism in our entire investigation today. What Orwell exposes is the psychological loop of reality control. He shows us exactly how power uses the manipulation of language to make intelligent people complicit in masking atrocities.
This is the loop we must trace. It operates like a suffocating algorithm. Step 1. Authority defines the acceptable language. They create sanitized euphemisms for terrible things.
Step 2. The institutions, the compliant press, the state bureaucracy, the loyal party members, endlessly repeat that language.
Step 3. Because the language has been fundamentally altered, the contradictions between the stated noble ideals and the brutal reality on the ground become harder and eventually impossible to even name. If you lack the words to describe your oppression, you cannot organize against it.
Step 4. Because you cannot name the problem, societal compliance grows.
Step 5. As compliance grows, the authority gains even more absolute power to define what is real and what is false. The loop tightens until reality itself is just whatever the party says it is.
This is the mechanical core of his brilliant essay, Politics and the English Language, and obviously it's the foundation of Newspeak in 1984.
Think about your own workplace or how modern corporate PR operates. We don't say we are firing thousands of people to boost the stock price. We say we are right-sizing the organization. We don't say civilian casualties or dead children. We say collateral damage.
We don't say kidnapping and torture. We say extraordinary rendition and enhanced interrogation. We use Latinate, multisyllabic, bureaucratic words to put a soft, snowy blanket over the bloody reality of what we are doing.
In 1984, this reaches its absolute nightmarish zenith with the party slogans. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. Orwell recognized the ultimate fatal bargain that totalitarianism offers.
The state says to the exhausted citizen, give us your freedom, give up your agonizing right to make decisions, give up your right to dissent, and in exchange, we will relieve you of the burden of responsibility. We will provide you with absolute security, and we will provide you with bread.
But the grim punchline of the 20th century is that you end up with neither.
Exactly. You get absolutely no freedom, and you get absolutely no bread. You starve in a gulag. But because the state maintains absolute terrifying control over the language and the perception of reality, the starving citizen is too terrified or too psychologically broken to point out the discrepancy.
And here is where Orwell delivers his darkest, most profound psychological insight about intellectuals and compliance. The victim eventually ends up doing the con man's work for him.
Yes.
Wait, I'm struggling to map this behavior. If you are an intellectual in London, and you've spent 10 years writing essays defending Stalin's regime, praising the glorious Soviet grain harvests, and then incontrovertible proof of the gulags and the mass graves is finally exposed, wouldn't basic human preservation and morality make you instantly distance yourself? Why on earth would you double down and do the con man's work?
Because of the fragility of the human ego. If that intellectual admits the truth of the gulags, they have to face a devastating, identity-destroying realization. They have to publicly admit that they were gullible, that their entire ideological framework was a lie, and that they were actively complicit in apologizing for mass murder.
And most people's egos simply cannot survive that level of psychological collapse.
So rather than admit they were conned and face the shame, they double down. They attack the whistleblowers. They defend the lie with even more ferocity. The genius of the totalitarian dictator is that he purposefully dirties up the population.
He makes everyone slightly complicit in the lie, so that exposing the regime means exposing their own deep, unbearable shame. They defend the dictator to defend themselves.
That is utterly chilling. It means totalitarianism isn't just a boot stamping on a human face forever. It's a boot stamping on a human face. And the face is desperately insisting to anyone who will listen that it actually feels like a deep tissue massage because admitting it's a boot is too humiliating.
Which brings us to the final phase of our deep dive. We are moving from Orwell's mid-century warnings to Hitchens' highly controversial application of these principles in the modern era. Here is where the mechanics get incredibly close to home, and where I must forcefully remind everyone of our impartiality boundary.
Right, because this gets heated.
Whether you view Christopher Hitchens as a brilliant modern rationalist or an apostate who betrayed his own ideals, we are strictly examining how he applied this framework. Paine's demand for rigorous dissent, Jefferson's warning about institutional tragedy, and Orwell's hatred of euphemism and totalitarian reality controlled the geopolitics of the 21st century.
Hitchens took these diagnostic tools, sharpened them, and pointed them directly at modern crises, making arguments that permanently alienated many of his former allies on the political left. The most prominent and undoubtedly the most fiercely debated application of this framework was his vociferous, unyielding intellectual support for the 2003 U.S.-led invasion of Iraq.
Let's break down the mechanics of how he used the rationalist framework to justify a preemptive war. Again, we are strictly reporting his rationale to understand the system he was attacking.
Hitchens argued that Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq was not merely a bad government or a run-of-the-mill authoritarian state. He diagnosed it, using Orwellian metrics, as a fully realized fascist, sadistic, totalitarian system that precisely mirrored the worst horrors of the mid-20th century.
And to justify intervention, Hitchens applied a very specific four-part rationalist test for when a nation-state fundamentally forfeits its sovereign right to exist without international interference.
The 4 conditions of losing sovereignty. If you are listening, try this mental exercise. Think of a controversial nation dominating the news today and apply these 4 rules. What is the first condition?
I think it was unprovoked military aggression.
Right. First, repeated unprovoked military aggression and invasions of neighboring countries. Second, gross violations of the Genocide Convention against their own people. Third, active, undeniable state sponsorship of international terrorism. And fourth, the active pursuit of weapons of mass destruction and blatant, repeated violations of the International Non-Proliferation Treaty.
And Hitchens argued that Saddam Hussein's Iraq was entirely unique on the global stage because it had routinely, brazenly, and documentedly violated all 4 of these conditions simultaneously for over a decade.
He invaded Iran and Kuwait. He used chemical weapons to commit genocide against the Kurdish population in Halabja. He harbored and funded terrorists, and he played a continuous shell game with UN weapons inspectors.
Now, on that last condition, the WMDs, we have to address the elephant in the room. The absolute failure to find vast, active stockpiles of chemical or nuclear weapons after the U.S. invasion is the defining historical legacy of that war. It is widely viewed as a catastrophic intelligence failure, or worse, a deliberate manipulation of the public. How did Hitchens, a man obsessed with empirical truth, handle that massive contradiction to his argument?
He fundamentally refused to accept the post-war narrative that the threat was entirely fabricated or illusory. He didn't focus on massive stockpiles. He focused on the mechanics of intent and latent capability that remained hidden until the regime fell.
He constantly pointed to specific, highly technical evidence that emerged after the invasion. For instance, he frequently cited the testimony of Dr. Mahdi Obeidi, who was Saddam Hussein's former chief nuclear physicist.
What did Dr. Obeidi reveal?
After the invasion, Dr. Obeidi led American forces to his own garden in Baghdad. Buried under a lotus tree, he revealed a full set of gas centrifuge components, the exact, highly sophisticated technology required to enrich uranium for a nuclear weapon, along with the massive, detailed blueprints required to restart the entire nuclear program.
Obeidi stated he was ordered to hide them there 12 years earlier by Saddam's son, Qusay Hussein, with explicit instructions to maintain the capability to reconstitute the program the moment international sanctions and inspectors were lifted.
For Hitchens, this was the smoking gun. He argued that this proved the regime would retain the absolute intent, the intellectual blueprint, and the foundational technology to become a nuclear threat. For Hitchens, applying the discipline of rationalism meant realizing that waiting for the threat to fully materialize under an irrational, psychopathic dictator was a failure of moral and intellectual courage.
And this uncompromising stance led directly to his brutal, bridge-burning critique of the modern anti-war movement. He looked at prominent figures on the left, like the British politician George Galloway or the American filmmaker Michael Moore, and accused them of falling into the exact same Orwellian trap as the intellectuals who defended Stalin in the 1930s.
He saw them engaging in the exact same loop of language manipulation. He ruthlessly criticized them for using sanitized euphemisms to mask a horrific reality. When the Western anti-war movement referred to Abu Musab al-Zarqawi and his al-Qaeda forces in Iraq as insurgents or a resistance movement, Hitchens was apoplectic.
He argued that these terms implied a noble, grassroots fight for national liberation. He pointed out the reality. These were not freedom fighters trying to build a democracy. They were a fiercely theocratic, fascist movement whose explicit stated goal was to establish a brutal totalitarian caliphate, and they used the sectarian bombing of mosques and the videotaped beheadings of aid workers as their primary political tools.
By calling them a resistance, Hitchens argued, Western intellectuals were actively sanitizing a totalitarian evil, simply because that evil happened to be opposing American foreign policy.
He believed they were letting their reflexive hatred of American imperialism blind them to a much darker, much older form of theocratic tyranny, which seamlessly connects to his final overarching argument, the thesis that made him globally famous in his later years, that religion, particularly fundamentalist messianic religion, is the ultimate, most dangerous system of absolute power.
Religion poisons everything was the famous subtitle of his best-selling book.
He applied this diagnostic lens globally to the most intractable geopolitical conflicts. Look at how he analyzed the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, or the ongoing conflict over the Kashmir region between nuclear-armed India and Pakistan. Hitchens argued that if these conflicts were purely secular, political disputes, arguments about drawing borders, allocating water rights, or distributing economic resources, they would be incredibly difficult, but they would ultimately be solvable.
Right. They could be solved through rational compromise, partition, and diplomacy.
A tough, agonizing negotiation, but mathematically, mechanically solvable in the physical world.
But the moment you introduce the concept of divine real estate into the political equation,
the moment a messianic fundamentalist faction on one side declares God himself gave us this specific piece of land and surrendering a single inch of it is a mortal sin against heaven, and a fundamentalist faction on the other side declares the exact same thing based on a different holy book rational compromise, becomes entirely impossible.
theocratic absolutism fundamentally short-circuits the Enlightenment. It replaces Thomas Paine's demand that we turn to human reason and to one another to solve our societal problems, with a rigid demand that we submit to the absolute, unquestionable authority of a cleric interpreting a sacred ancient text.
And when you cannot compromise, the only remaining tool is endless violence.
And this brings us to the core synthesis of our investigation. Whether you are listening to this and you strongly agree with Christopher Hitchens' aggressive support for the Iraq War, or you vehemently, fundamentally despise his position, Whether you share his militant atheism and view it as a breath of fresh air, or you find his attacks on faith to be deeply offensive and misguided, the underlying mechanical warning of his analysis remains incredibly potent.
The warning is that we must rigorously, mercilessly, and constantly question the language and the euphemisms used by our own side. If we only challenge the propaganda of our obvious enemies, but we blindly accept the sanitized buzzwords and the institutional PR of our political allies, we become actively complicit in masking reality.
We become the terrified victim doing the command's work. We allow the system to reproduce its power through our own silence. Which brings us to the culmination of this deep dive. What is the crisis in perception here?
The crisis is the dangerous, seductive, and lazy belief that human liberty is permanently secured once noble principles are declared on a piece of parchment. We fall into the perception gap of thinking that because we have a constitution or a declaration of human rights or a democratic election, that the work of rationalism is done.
But the hidden structure of absolute power doesn't care about paper declarations.
That structure only becomes visible when we stop staring at the soaring ideals and start aggressively examining the quiet mechanics. Who is actually allowed to claim those rights in practice? Which massive contradictions are institutions willing to silently tolerate to maintain their wealth and stability? How is ideological obedience quietly rewarded with access and status? And most importantly, how is brutal coercion and subjugation constantly disguised as administrative necessity through the endless manipulation of language?
It is a constant, exhausting, never-ending battle against the gravity of human nature. Power always wants to consolidate. Can liberty survive without people willing to challenge obvious enemies, their heroes, institutions, and preferred narratives?
Crisis in perception is not about telling people what to think. It is about making the systems shaping perception more visible. Because when structural forces remain hidden, meaningful change becomes far more difficult to imagine.
Every book is more than a collection of facts. It's a lens through which we can examine the systems shaping our world. Whether today's investigation challenged what you thought you knew or simply encouraged you to ask better questions, the goal remains the same: to think critically, follow the evidence, and remain open to changing your mind when the facts lead somewhere unexpected.
Crisis in perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
Until next time, stay curious, keep questioning, and learn to spot the crisis in perception.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, share, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.